All right, good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. We are going to talk our way through some high points of the 1920s notes. I want to emphasize, as I always do, that there's a lot of stuff that we're going to be clicking over relatively lightly that you do definitely still need to know for the exam. I'm trying to hit some of the highlights, but you want to make sure that you are keeping up with your reading to the best of your ability and understanding things that are in there that aren't necessarily in the notes set themselves. Okay. So the 1920s is a pretty interesting decade that does a couple of things. A lot of times historians like to refer to the 20s as kind of the first modern decade. So that's an interesting thought that you should be sort of thinking a little bit about. It's a relatively common angle into the 20s if you were to get asked a question about the decade. And in order to answer it, you have to think a little bit about what it means to be modern. What does modern mean to you? When you say a decade is modern, what the features would you expect it to have, those types of things. I think the 20s is particularly interesting as a study in the fact that history doesn't always move in a straight line in the way that we want it to. The notes that we're going to take a look at here are divided into politics, economics, and society. And we're going to see in some ways that the 20s is kind of like progressive and moving forward in kind of linear ways that seem logical out of the progressive era. And in other ways, it's a very regressive era, an era that's kind of like a backlash against what came before it. So that's info about the census is also in your book, but just a note that the 20s is really our first urban-dominated decade. It's the first decade where we have more people living in the city than in the country. And that is a source of some kind of fear and anxiety for a lot of those people who are still living in the country and who see the city as kind of a scary place in many ways, sort of anti-American in some ways. So that's a little bit of like an underpinning for the whole note. So 1920s government. Government of the 1920s, like I said, is pretty reactionary, and there's no way that you can see that more clearly than when you look at like the presidency and the various elections of the 20s. So this is the 1920 electoral map that you're taking a look at here. There's a couple of things of note. So number one, we see that solid South kind of hanging in strong down there, right? That's our South that's been voting for the Democratic Party every single election basically since Reconstruction ended. Also note that we've got like a couple of people you've probably never heard of over here, nor would you really have any reason to. This is an election that both of the two parties have lost their like big deal standard bearer, right? Wilson has died, or excuse me, has had a stroke and is incapacitated out of the Democratic Party. Teddy Roosevelt has died just like about a year before the election, just as he was kind of starting to campaign. So both the Republicans and the Democrats are going with kind of like on relatively unknown national people. This is Warren G. Harding down here in the red. He's the Republican candidate, and he is the candidate who's going to win. The Democrats are going to put up a guy named James Cox. Harding is a senator from Ohio, and Cox is the governor, or vice versa. But they're both from Ohio, basically, and they're relatively similar, personalities themselves. This is also probably the last we're going to see of this dude here in the yellow. This is Eugene B. Debs, who's been around for quite a while at this point. This is the last of his 5 runs at the presidency. He's actually in jail in 1920 while he's running for office. He still manages to come up with about 5.5% of the popular vote over here. So he does it relatively well, but that's Eugene B. Debs on the Socialist Party ticket. So Harding runs on this return to normalcy platform. And normalcy is a word that Harding makes up, but that comes to sort of stand for this idea of like moving away from the progressive era and back to kind of a time when, like American values were strong, etc. And so Harding really represents, again, this kind of backlash against the war and against progressivism, against the idea of sort of like, standing for something and kind of making changes. I mean, Harding very much is a part 2 of the Gilded Age presidents. So if you think back at some of those Gilded Age presidents like Grover Cleveland or like Rutherford B. Hayes or some of those guys who are also like relatively unknown, Harding is very much like in that line. He's very strongly laissez-faire. He believes, in that businesses should be able to run themselves and that it's not really the government's job to like help people. Another thing about Harding that comes up fairly often is that his administration is going to be pretty scandal-ridden. It's kind of like Ulysses S. Grant, where it's not that he himself is ever accused of being corrupt, but he hires a bunch of people like in his cabinet, kind of top-level advisors, who are indicted in several fairly big scandals. Up until Watergate, the biggest scandal in presidential history was this Teapot Dome scandal that's referenced down here. Basically what happened was Harding's Secretary of the Interior was a guy named Albert Fall, and he took bribes, money from a bunch of oil companies to sell them the Teapot Dome lands was like a almost like a parkland in Wyoming that was owned by the government. So he sold that land off real cheap to oil companies and then like got bribes or kickbacks from the oil companies themselves. So really similar to something like Credit Mobilier from the Gilded Age or like the Whiskey Ring or the Indian Ring. So it's just sort of, again, like this little mini Gilded Age. If you ever look, by the way, at a ranking of U.S. presidents, Warren G. Harding is almost always near the bottom. Usually the only people that are worse than him are like the people right before the Civil War, like James Buchanan, who just basically like let the South secede. It's Warren G. Harding's almost always down there, partially because of the scandals, and then also partially because he dies relatively early. He's only president for like about 2.5 years. 1923, August 1923. He dies of a stroke, nothing unnatural or anything like that. But his presidency passes on to his vice president, who is Coolidge, Calvin Coolidge, who is also a very kind of laissez-faire, like old school Republican in the Gilded Age style, and is going to continue on. Coolidge's most famous quote or statement is up here: "This the business of America is business." So this idea that kind of the most important thing that goes on in the United States is kind of this business aspect. As you can see from like the bills that I have up here on the slide, that Coolidge, was very committed to, again, kind of old school Republican policies, high tariffs, a laissez-faire government that's really uninvolved would be sort of, the pride of, again, like Grover Cleveland or somebody like that. When we take a look at 1920s foreign policy, we also see kind of a return to old U.S. policy. We are going to continue our involvement in Latin America. So that Roosevelt corollary stuff, that's still kind of going on. But otherwise, the U.S. basically goes almost completely isolationist. We stay out of the League of Nations. We signed this Kellogg-Briand Treaty, which is going to kind of come back to bite us and several other countries in the butt when in the road to World War II. It's basically a treaty promising not to go to war, which works really great as long as you don't have someone like, Hitler, who's pushing the world toward war. And then maybe most tellingly to me anyway is this last one here, the Washington Naval Treaty, the Five Powers Treaty. And what this is a bunch of countries, it's basically the Allies plus like Japan, which you can see down here, who are signing a treaty that's obligating them to like disarm. During the Spanish-American War and World War One, the U.S. had built up a pretty sizable navy, but under the Washington Naval Treaty, we're going to sort of scrap that all, sell it all off, right? Get rid of a big chunk of it, so that when World War II rolls along, we've got to build back up again. So that's a good example of kind of like our isolationism and our run away from like war or international involvement after World War One. Another good example, it's not exactly foreign policy, but sort of along the same lines, are immigration restrictions. The 1920s are the first decade in American history, like since we became a country in 1789 with George Washington. This is the first time that we have widespread immigration restrictions. So we've restricted groups before, right? We had the Chinese Exclusion Act in the 1880s, but this is the first time we've had anything like that's kind of like blanket restrictions. There's several acts early in the 20s. There's a big spike of immigration after World War One, and kind of freak out. And we passed several emergency acts, and then in 1924 we get the kind of crown jewel of this whole immigration restriction thing. It's called the National Origins Act, or the Johnson-Reed Act. And what this does is set up a quota system. So what it says is it identifies individual countries, and for each individual country it sets a quota, or like a top limit on how many immigrants can come in from that country each year. So, from Great Britain, we can accept, X many immigrants. From Italy, we can accept, Y many immigrants, that type of thing. They used like previous immigration numbers to set the percent. So that's why you see this like 3% gate here in the political cartoon. And basically, the way that it winds out, if you look at the quotas and at how many people are coming in from where, we basically have pretty light quotas, like not very restrictive, on countries from Western Europe, from England and France, and kind of our buddies who are Anglo-Saxon Protestants. Those countries are still relatively easy to get into the U.S. from, but they place really heavy restrictions, very steep quotas, like small quotas, on Central Europe, Eastern Europe, I apologize. Places where we might have kind of radical, immigrants coming in. This is kind of the tail end of that Red Scare that we talked about in the last note set. Also, real heavy restrictions, as you can see down here, on Mexican immigration, kind of for the first time, on immigration from Asia. The idea here, these quota systems, these are going to basically stay in place pretty strongly until the next time we're going to tinker with our immigration policy, like 1965. So about 40 years. Where these quota systems that are very blatantly targeting specific countries to block immigration from, where they are in place. So that's another important thing that comes up pretty frequently about the 20s. And whenever we talk about immigration, we also have to talk about kind of the corresponding wave of nativism. So we already talked about the Red Scare, and that was something that followed World War I and was aimed at, again, this sort of fear of anti-immigrants. And there's two things that we see in the 20s going on that are good indicators that that aspect of the Red Scare continues. One is the trial of two Italian immigrants, Sacco and Vanzetti, who are both admitted anarchists. They're on trial for robbery and murder in 1920. The case becomes like this sort of international cause célèbre because the defense attorney chooses to turn this into essentially like a referendum or a case that's about this question of how fair of a trial did these two men get because they are immigrants. The police don't really handle the case very well. There's not a lot of evidence. If this was presented in like a fair modern day courtroom, the likelihood is that they probably wouldn't have been convicted, even though it's possible that one of the two of them was actually involved in the robbery. There's just not a lot of good evidence. But even after several appeals in 1927, the two of them are going to be executed. And the Sacco and Vanzetti case is often cited as an example of kind of the rising tide of nativism. So that's a good one to know about. The other thing that's going on, unfortunately, is that we see a resurrection of the Klan. The last time that the Klan was heavily in existence was like at the end of Reconstruction. And what they were trying to do then was they were trying to suppress the Republican vote and kind of put down or oppress the black population of the South back socially to the point where they were under slavery, right? So to sort of recreate the social conditions of slavery. And they basically do that, right? We get Jim Crow laws in place, the Supreme Court pokes loopholes in the 14th and 15th Amendments, and so the Klan kind of dies out. Like if you're looking for the KKK in 1900, you're really not going to find it. But with the Red Scare and the wave of anti-immigrant sentiment, the Klan is going to come kind of roaring back right around the time of World War I. And a lot of times the thing that's pointed to as kind of reviving the Klan is actually this movie here. It's a silent movie in black and white, done by a filmmaker named D.W. Griffith. And Woodrow Wilson, amazing human being that he was, screened it at the White House. Yay. What The Birth of a Nation was, it was a story of sort of the Klan origin, like how the Klan was founded, but it's just this extremely romanticized version that has like the Klan as the saviors of white womanhood who were kind of, anti-crime vigilantes, like I don't know, Batman or something on horses. And it creates a renewed interest in the Klan. And so in the 20s, we see the Klan not just like in the South and aimed at the black population, but start to become kind of a national organization that's aimed at like basically anybody who's not white, Anglo-Saxon, Protestant, like specific type of Christian. So this is when the Klan really takes up against like Catholics and Jewish people and like immigrants in general, in addition, of course, to the African American community as well. So the Klan grows in like size and scope, you could say, in the 1920s. This is a really chilling picture of a Klan rally down here in the bottom corner of 1926, right in front of the Capitol building. So that they're very much sort of on the rise, and the rise in Klan membership is going to continue from the 1920s, kind of in a continual upward sweep up to about the 1960s during the Civil Rights Movement's about its height. So that's some of the things kind of going on in 1920s government and adjacent. Again, very like reactionary in many ways. Economically, however, the 20s is a pretty modernist decade, I guess you could say, in a way. We're going to continue our focus on manufacturing. A lot of these things like that are in here, so concentration of wealth, etc., the manufacturing boom, a lot of those are both strengths of the 1920s economy and also like eventual weaknesses that lead to the Great Depression. One important shift to note on here, I'm not talking about all this, but one important shift to note on here is that we're continuing to make things like steel and oil and like those kind of base commodities, but we're also increasingly going to start to make luxury goods. So consumer goods like automobiles or like refrigerators or appliances or things of that. Like if you take a look at the next slide, this slide right here, it's got a lot of good examples of some early 1920s appliances, like toasters and ice boxes and things of that nature. And so these consumer goods, they're called consumer durables sometimes. We're producing a lot of them, but what we don't realize that we're doing in the 20s is we're oversaturating the market. We're making like too many, largely because we haven't figured out yet that we need to make stuff that will break in a year or two. So like, when you get a new phone, right, that that phone's not going to last 40 years, it's going to start to break in 2 years when your plan is up or whatnot. Or even if it doesn't break, you know that they're going to put out, 6 new versions with bells and whistles that you just have to have in, rose gold or whatever. That's called planned obsolescence. It's like a way that we design things to make it so that people have to buy more eventually. We hadn't quite figured that out in the 1920s, which is why, like, if you might have grandparents who still have, like old, refrigerators or old washing machines or things like that from like the 1930s that wouldn't get destroyed by a nuclear explosion. And so we're creating this surplus of consumer goods in the 20s almost without realizing it. And that's also going to be one of the things that's going to be a weakness in the economy when we hit the Great Depression. Okay. Speaking of automobiles, right, of course, our main person here is Henry Ford. Now, you want to be careful not to ever say that Ford invented the automobile. What he does is popularize and make it more efficient and much cheaper. So women in the workplace, this is a thing. We do see a rise in women in the workplace, but it's not, women doctors or things like that. It's women in sort of like service type jobs. So, typists or store clerks, telegraph operators, those types of things. So you see a rise in women going to college, but a lot of them find when they get out of college that they can't, there aren't jobs for them that are like college educated type jobs. So a little bit of forward, a little bit of backwards, as we see often with women's rights. Another thing that's on the rise in the 20s is the advertising industry. Since we're creating a lot of different consumer goods, we have to, or we need to, sell our own particular brand, right? The Hoover vacuum cleaner versus, the Star vacuum cleaner. The Frigidaire is a very early and still around brand for refrigerators, basically ice boxes as they were called at the time. I have a couple pages of 1920s ads in here, largely, I'm not going to lie, largely because I find them amusing, like these for La Pal obesity soap, right, which will make you skinny just by washing with soap. If you take a look at these, you'll notice that they're missing one thing that would like definitely be on an ad like this today, and that is some sort of disclaimer down here at the bottom. Soap does not actually make you skinny. Do not eat the soap, right? All that kind of stuff. And that's because the advertising industry is so new that it's not really very regulated yet. So they're able to do things like, this is a very famous ad campaign by Listerine, which is a new brand in this time period. They essentially invented the disease that they called by the very scientific sounding name of halitosis, which just means bad breath, to try to convince people that they needed this new product, this mouthwash or toothpaste or whatever, that they hadn't needed before. So the advertising industry is a good example of the kind of consumer culture of the 1920s. If you're asking yourself, like, well, how are people buying all of this stuff, which is a good question to ask, the answer to that is that wages have gone up a little, but more so what's happening is that we're seeing a lot of availability of easy credit. So big ticket things like cars or refrigerators, houses, those types of things are available to people who hadn't been able to buy them before and maybe like shouldn't be buying them now given their income. So today, if you were going to buy a car, $50,000 car on a loan, you were going to pay some odd a month. Like that's normal. We still do that today. But what they'll do first is they'll check your credit score, right, to make sure that you can afford the payments and that you have a good history of paying things back, etc. Well, none of those like safeguards really existed in the 20s. So you've got a lot of credit being extended to people who like probably shouldn't be getting credit. And as the slide says, there's a lot of people kind of living like at or above their means. This is fine as long as your paycheck keeps coming in, right? As long as you're still making what you were expecting to make. The problem comes when you lose your job, like, say, when the stock market crashes. So this is another one of those things that's going to be kind of an underlying weakness of the economy that the Great Depression will play out. Stock market speculation, we'll talk a little bit more about this when we do the Great Depression notes, but just notice this really sharp rise starting at about 1928, especially right here, this upward swing, like that's not good. When the stock market does that, you want to be very careful because it generally comes right back down as it's going to do. A good example of the almost obsession that people have with business in this decade is the fact that in 1925, there's a best-selling book, like really super best-selling, written called The Man Nobody Knows, all about how Jesus was the ultimate businessman. It's this like long extended metaphor about like Jesus as like a CEO and like the apostles and disciples as like under managers. And I mean it's a little bit of an odd read from a modern day perspective, but it's a great example of again how business oriented or business focused the 1920s culture was. Only sector of the American economy that was not booming in the 20s was agricultural farming. You can take a look sort of at this a little bit more at your leisure here, but basically between like natural disasters like the boll weevils and drought, and then the lack of help from the American government, the production, over farming that's been happening in the West, since we settled it, basically. The farming industry is really hurting again, especially starting about the mid 1920s. Anytime there's a depression, the farmers tend to feel it first and like feel it longest. So this is maybe not a surprise. Last and biggest section of the note set we're going to pick up in just. All right, so 1920 society, last and biggest section. Usually when people talk about the 20s as a modern decade, what they're talking about is 1920 society, right? That tends to be where that comes from. So we're going to just kind of take a look at a few of these. This is more like a table of contents almost for this section. So first thing to check in on is prohibition. So I think most of you guys know a little bit about this, right? In 1919, the 18th Amendment is passed, which makes it illegal to sell, distribute, manufacture, etc., alcohol as of January 1st, 1920. So there's about a year or so lead time, and that's going to wind up being pretty key here. And so prohibition goes into effect in 1920. It's going to go on the whole decade. It's not repealed until 1933. And so when the amendment is passed, they have to pass some act that's going to specify, okay, what happens if you get caught drinking, or what are the, what does alcohol mean? Like what actually consists of alcohol. And so the act that they passed to lay out all of the particulars of the amendment is this Volstead Act down here at the bottom, Volstead Act. And so what that does is it defines alcohol, number one, as anything with more than 0.5% or 0.5% alcohol. So that's really low, right? That's you could find sauerkraut with more alcohol than that, or German chocolate cake. Or something like that. So it creates a really strict standard. There were a lot of people who had supported the 18th Amendment thinking that it was only going to apply to what was often called hard liquor or hard spirits, so things like gin and brandy and rum, distilled spirits, and weren't expecting it to apply to beer or wine or hard cider, that type of stuff that is commonly drunk with meals, etc. So that's flaw number one of the Volstead Act. And then in addition to setting a really hard line, the Volstead Act also weirdly creates a lot of loopholes. So for example, I just mentioned hard cider. In order to allow farmers' wives to preserve their fruit, the Volstead Act allows for continued production of hard cider. So if you have a cherry orchard, you can make, cherry brandy or etc., that type of thing. It also allows people to keep and consume any alcohol that they have as of January 1st, 1920. So you had to register and get a sticker on your bottle of liquor or whatever that you had already purchased it before Prohibition went into effect. So, there's this year of lag time. So people just stock up, right, if you have any degree of money. One of the most well-known sort of society gentlemen's clubs of the 1920s, the Yale Club, they stock enough liquor in their private basement to last for 15 years. Which turns out to be long enough. So we've got that. You've got things like religious exemptions. You could get Passover wine and communion wine, which of course winds up getting misused. A lot of people get very sick all of a sudden because you could get medical prescriptions. So there's a lot of loopholes. And then in addition to the loopholes, on top of all of that, there's a tremendous lack of funding for enforcement. The federal government basically passes this amendment, and then it's just okay, states now enforce it. And several of the states just basically say no. I think it's New Jersey and a couple of others that just essentially say we're not spending a dime on prohibition enforcement. So those states just kind of essentially have no prohibition. And in other states, we see a struggle for enforcement to keep up. I think that there's only something like 12,000 prohibition agents on the federal level. And you can think about how many people they would need to enforce a law like this. It's a lot more than 12,000. They basically thought that once they made it the law, that people would follow the law, because people generally do. But it turns out that when it's a law that a lot of people aren't morally behind, it doesn't work out so well. So because of these loopholes and the lack of enforcement and the lack of money, what we see, of course, is that a tremendous amount of people become what the slang at the time called scofflaws, or people who scoff at the law, right, and who do not pay attention to it. And so we see drinking continue in underground speakeasies, which are drinking clubs. Bootlegger is a term for someone who illegally makes or sells alcohol. Could be anybody from your neighbor making, bathtub gin and selling it to Al Capone, who runs the biggest liquor distribution channel on the East Coast. And it also creates a sense of legitimacy for the criminal activity that comes to surround bootlegging, specifically the rise of the mob. I don't think you can say that prohibition caused the rise of the mob exactly, but it certainly helps the rise of the mob. The mafia's been around in the U.S. since there's been Italian immigration, pretty much. But what prohibition does is it gives them like a legitimate revenue stream that they can make a lot of money off of. And so we see a bunch of like almost mob wars over prohibition territory. It's going to lead to a huge rise in crime. Capone's headed in Chicago, and Chicago has just like a really bad couple of years of kind of mob violence. They're eventually going to sort of sort this out, but the 30s, like the late 20s, excuse me, and early 30s, while prohibition is going on, this is the height of the kind of like gangster culture. So if you think like whatever, Pretty Boy Floyd, or like Bonnie and Clyde, or Bugsy Moran, or any of those kind of like famous gangsters, that's really this time period, and it's a result of prohibition and machine guns and automobiles all kind of combining to create a culture where this type of crime is relatively easy. Other things that are going on culturally in the U.S. in the 1920s, we have this, what we refer to as mass culture. And what that basically means is the idea that it's not just you in your little town, experiencing the music that's being played in your living room or whatever. It's culture that's being experienced in the same way by people all over the country at the same time. And so we see that fueled by like the advertising industry, right, as a good source of mass culture, right, to spread brands and slogans and sayings and things like that all around the country. Department stores like JCPenney's, which have catalogs, and grocery stores that sell brands that become kind of national chains, those types of things start to spread, again, common sort of experiences, common products all across the country. The Hollywood film industry. The 1920s is really the first decade where we could say we have a Hollywood film industry, and the movies, and I don't have it on here, I should, but radio as well. All those things are going to kind of fuel the enjoyment of the same kind of pastimes by a lot of people all across the country. So radio, here's radio. Our first big radio station to broadcast in the U.S. is KDKA in Pittsburgh. The radio played music, it played news, it played shows. So you can imagine watching like a TV show, but like with the picture off and listening to the sound. That was kind of like what people would do, like these boys down here. They'd listen to like the Lone Ranger, or they had like soap opera type shows, those kinds of things. Movies transitioned into like a big industry. They moved from New York out to Hollywood, where you can film outside pretty much year round. And they take on a bunch of different varieties, mostly silent movies for the most part during the 20s. There's 1927, The Jazz Singer. That's the first what was called talkie, or like picture with sound, and that's very quickly going to become the standard. But like classic horror movies, westerns were really popular. This is Rudy Valentino, who was like the big heartthrob of the 1920s for some reason. It left a sort of desert romance epic, The Sheik and the Son of the Sheik, that kind of thing. And so along with Hollywood, we also get our first decade where we really have what we call movie stars. If you think about in this class up to this point, how it was that you got to be famous in the U.S., like what kind of people were known by everybody all across the country. It's pretty much three categories of people. You've got presidents, you've got generals for like big war generals like Grant or somebody like that, and you've got businessmen like Rockefeller. Like that's pretty much it, right? But what the movie theater gives us, and what the 1920s give us in general, is this new category of like celebrity, people who are famous for entertainment purposes. So all the people who are listed up here are like well-known movie stars in the 1920s. Mary Pickford and Clara Bow in particular are really often credited with spreading the what we're going to call the flapper culture that comes to define the new woman of the 1920s. The flapper look, I think, is something that most of you are probably a little familiar with, right? It exposes a good deal more skin than people who are accustomed to Victorian fashions, right? This is sort of Victorian era, flapper era. And it, a lot of things like obvious makeup and short hair that were considered scandalous, just a generation or so before. But the thing that I always like to point out, or that's pretty important down here, is you would never want to, in like an essay, for example, be like, the 1920s came along and all the women became flappers or something like that, because it really is, it's an urban, and it's kind of a young trend. So it's, women in, their late teens or into their 20s, who live in cities, those kinds of things. If you lived in rural Chatham County and you were in your 30s, like you were not a flapper in the 1920s, and you were probably a little bit scared of women who were. So it's a youth, it's not teen, we're not quite a teenager yet, but it's definitely a youth or a young person's movement that is both in like fashion and then also kind of in attitude. I love this picture. This is like not the most quintessential flapper picture you can find. So she's sort of in this unladylike sprawl, right? She's, smoking. She kind of looks like she's just come in from like a long, hard night out, wearing makeup and, these kind of, they're called like Lindy hoppers or low hopper shoes down there. So those types of evidence of this, again, kind of like young, modern woman who would, stay out all night dancing to jazz music with men in clubs, right, that type of thing. The 1920s are a very fad-heavy decade. People are really interested in, whenever you have a rise in the middle class, you have a rise in like leisure time. And so people are going to spend their leisure time in the 20s in some pretty odd ways. They don't get off the internet and cat videos, so they've got to figure out something else to do. They're going to wind up spending some time flagpole sitting, which is exactly what it sounds like. It's literally climbing up a flagpole and sitting or standing on top of it to see how long you can stay up there. Lots of interest in like boarding card games, magic and illusions. Freud is really trendy in this time period, so people are all about, like what colors your id and dream interpretations and all of that kind of stuff, all big in the 20s. Again, celebrity culture also extends to sporting. Two biggest spectator sports in the U.S. in the 1920s are baseball, right, everything I call up here, and then boxing. So Jack Dempsey, who was a major heavyweight champion. The college football is pretty big too, not so much national football, and then that's pretty much it. It's like baseball, boxing, and college football. This is Gertrude Ederle, who's a very well-known swimmer. First woman to swim across the English Channel. And then this guy over here, it's not exactly sports, but along the same line, Charles Lindbergh, arguably the biggest celebrity of the 1920s. Him or like Charlie Chaplin. That's probably my two people I would put up for that category. And he's a famous pilot. He is the first person to fly all the way across the Atlantic Ocean by himself. He flies from New York to Paris in like 33 and a half hours, pretty amazingly. And when he touches down in Paris, he almost instantly becomes like a pretty big celebrity. He's going to be around for a little while. Unfortunately, he's eventually going to become kind of associated with like Nazism. He's a little bit of a closet Nazi, you might say. So we're going to touch in on him a little more when we talk about the America First movement in the road to World War II. So 1920s music, the styles of dance that involved like close partner dancing, like this up here, dancing to jazz and ragtime, in like trend dances, almost in the same way that you might have people, I don't even know it, if you want to go back 10 years doing like the Soldier Boy or something like that, you would get these dances that were popular, like the turkey trot or the bunny hop or something like that. If you want to waste some of your time watching 1920s dances, Google like the bunny hop or the grizzly bear, and see what pops up on YouTube. They're relatively entertaining. But so lots of interest in kind of fast-paced, like upbeat type music. We're going to talk a little bit more about jazz in just a sec here when we talk about the Harlem Renaissance. So the 1920s is often characterized as the jazz age, not because like everybody listened to jazz so much, more so because jazz is energetic and syncopated and improvised, and a lot of people felt that was the energy of the 1920s was also sort of emblemized or symbolized in the jazz music as well. There were a lot of people who didn't think the 1920s were so much fun, or thought that fun was empty and meaningless. And we usually refer to them as the lost generation writers. So these are some people who you probably will end up running into in English at some point in your school career, if you have not already. Are very well-known American writers who wrote a lot about the sort of emptiness or meaninglessness of American society in the 20s. The two guys that I have highlighted in yellow are definitely your most important and most likely to come up. So F. Scott Fitzgerald's novel, The Great Gatsby, if you have read it, or if you have not yet, but you probably will, is basically about a bunch of high-class New York society people and how utterly awful and like devoid of human feelings they are. It really emphasizes how empty the kind of party nature of like wealthy New York society is. Hemingway's fiction focuses a lot more directly on the impacts of the war. So he writes a lot of books about soldiers who die alone in the rain. That's a direct subtweet of Farewell to Arms right there. And then just sort of the futility of war. It's very existentialist type novels. We're going to see a mirror to this critique of American society as being very empty when we hit the 1950s and we talk about the beat movement or the beatniks like Jack Kerouac. So this is a pretty common point of comparison and contrast that the College Board likes to pull in. 1920s critique of society versus the 1950s critique of society. So that's a good thing to kind of note down that you might be expected to do eventually. Another modern aspect of the 20s that your textbook talks a little bit about is the fact that there's a big interest in science. You can kind of take a look at this slide at your leisure, but the thing that I want to especially point out is that it's not so much necessarily that all of these scientific ideas are so new, as that more people are being exposed to them, because with an increasing middle class comes an increasing amount of people making it to high school. So not having to drop out in, sixth grade to go work in the coal mines, people are able to stick around long enough to get to like basic biology, for example. And so more and more people are running into theories like the theory of human evolution that have been around for a long time and are widely accepted in this like scientific educated community, but haven't been necessarily talked about a lot in, say rural Tennessee, for example. And so in response to the increasing pervasiveness of science and science teaching, we see, arguably, we see this backlash in religion called fundamentalism. Rise in fundamentalist Christianity in U.S. in the 1920s. Basically, when we talk about fundamentalist Christianity, we're talking about a type of Christianity that believes that everything that's in the Bible is literally true. So if the Bible says the world was created in 6 days, the world was created in 6 days. If the Bible says Jonah was swallowed by a big fish and, he lived in its belly, like that is what happened. It's a very literal reading of the Bible, which then creates problems with things like the theory of human evolution, of course. And so we see a rise of like fundamentalist preachers. The two names that you might need to know are these two people right here, Billy Sunday and Amy Semple McPherson. They're both pretty interesting figures in their own rights. You can take a look at it if you'd like to. But the two of them are like radio preachers who help spread evangelism. A little bit ironic, right, to use a modern medium like radio to spread fundamentalism, but there you are. And the height of this kind of tension between the rise of fundamentalism on one hand and the rise of like scientific modernism on the other hand comes with the very famous Scopes trial. So this is a pretty important trial for, it's not like a Supreme Court case or anything. It's just a little local trial in a town called Dayton, Tennessee. And what's going on is that Tennessee has passed a law that outlaws the teaching of human evolution in public schools. And the ACLU, which is just formed, the ACLU is founded in 1920, so it's a new organization. And what they're looking to do is they're looking for a teacher who's willing to challenge the law. So they did up this guy in Dayton, this guy named John Scopes, who's a substitute science teacher essentially, and to get him to break the law, he teaches his kids human evolution, right? He gets jailed under the law, so fined, I think. They probably would have just stayed like a relatively small local thing, but they wind up attracting some of the biggest and most well-known lawyers in the country at the time. William Jennings Bryan is a very, very famous politician, right? He's run for president like 4 times at this point. He's Secretary of State under Woodrow Wilson. He's extremely well known and also a very, like a fundamentalist sort of believer in fundamentalism and in sort of Christian morality. And so he decides to take on the prosecution position. And this would be like if, I don't even know, like Al Gore or Joe Biden decided to be like the lawyer for this little podunk case. And because Bryan comes in, it's going to bring in Clarence Darrow, who was probably the most well-known criminal lawyer of the period. He had just wrapped up a very sensationalistic murder trial, the Warren and Loeb murder trial case. And so that the trial itself becomes this kind of like zoo, not to pun on the monkey trial thing. They film parts of it, so there's like newsreels of it. They broadcast the whole thing live on radio. They build like they build a flight strip so that they can fly out the daily films like every day, and it becomes this kind of big circus when it should have just been like, okay, Scopes broke the law, like he's in jail. But what winds up happening is because the case attracts so much attention, at the end of it, even though Scopes, loses because he broke the law, and the case kind of fades away, but it scares enough states into sort of quietly removing references to human evolution from science textbooks. And so from the 1920s until basically like the space race and Sputnik, there's not a lot of emphasis on the teaching of like upper level sciences, including human evolution, in K-12 schools. It's like you pretty much have to go to college to learn any of that. So Scopes trial is a really good example again of the clash between kind of modernism and quote unquote traditional values. Okay. Last little segment here deals with a kind of continuation of society that is 1920s culture, and more specifically the like subculture of the Harlem Renaissance. So we're going to start with just a little look in at like the mainstream America, which was, mainstream aesthetic of the 1920s, which was what we call Art Deco. When you take a look at Art Deco things like the 2 paintings on this slide, for like the various artifacts and buildings on this slide, what you should notice about it is that it's very geometric. It's a lot of very kind of like, let's call it shapy lines and things broken down into their component parts. They don't necessarily look like actual, like this doesn't look like the way that a woman actually looks. It's a woman sort of broken down into like basic shapes. It's very early beginnings of like modernist painting is what we're looking at here. And so this Art Deco style is going to wind up being kind of combined with a lot of influences from the Black community to create what is going to become kind of the Harlem Renaissance style. So this is just like a little bit of background before we get into that. Okay. So the Black community is experiencing and undergoing some pretty strong changes in the 1920s, and especially what's going on and what's particularly important is this Great Migration that I kind of mentioned in the last note set. This is the long-term movement, the first time that we've really seen large amounts of African Americans moving out of the rural South, like the sharecropping area down here, and up into northern cities like New York and Philadelphia, Albany, Baltimore, right, Detroit, Milwaukee, places where they're taking manufacturing jobs. And it's not that there's never been African Americans in the North before, but it's been a pretty stable population. Like, you know, before the Civil War, Philadelphia had the largest free Black community in the country, and it pretty much still does at this point in time. And they're mostly people whose families have lived in these northern cities, you know, kind of for generations. So what we have for the first time is, as a result of the Great Migration, is like a growth in the Black population, urban Black population in the North, and also a mingling of kind of the northern Black culture with this sort of southern rural Black culture as well. And those two things combined in cities like Harlem and Chicago and Detroit are going to produce what we are going to come to call the Harlem Renaissance. There is, in the 1920s, as arguably there is still today, and certainly throughout a lot of the 20th century, a conflict in the Black community over sort of what the goal of activism should be. And nobody really exemplifies that better than Marcus Garvey in the 20s. Garvey is an interesting and controversial figure. He is most known for founding UNIA, the United Negro Improvement Association, and for headlining this, what he called the Back to Africa movement. And so Garvey is a good example of what we're going to start to call Black nationalism or Black separatism sometimes. And this is the idea that the goal of the Black community should not be to integrate with white society. Garvey basically said that segregation is so bad here, and the treatment, you know, historically and generationally has been so bad of the Black people, that the goal shouldn't be to, you know, assimilate into white society, but instead to build up a strong Black society elsewhere. And so what he advocated for was like mass resettlement, essentially, in Africa. So hence the Back to Africa movement. Garvey, depending on who you're talking to, either legitimately or because of harassment, gets charged with mail fraud for soliciting donations to his Black Star Line, which is like the steamship line that he was trying to found. He's an immigrant. He's from Jamaica originally, so he gets deported back to Jamaica, and his movement, the Garveyism, sort of dies out a little bit. But it's notable for a couple of reasons. Number one, it picks up on a lot of Woodrow Wilson's language about sort of self-determination of nations and sort of people governing themselves. And number two, it's also a really good forerunner to what we're going to see in the 1960s with Malcolm X. So when we come and we talk about the civil rights movement and we talk about Malcolm X's philosophy and the Nation of Islam's philosophy, there's going to be a lot of echoes of what Garvey is saying here, of sort of, again, not assimilating and focusing more on the Black community rather than on integrating. Okay. So that's Marcus Garvey on one end. On the other end, what we see, and more prominently and more extensively, is this Harlem Renaissance, or what was at the time a lot of times called the New Negro movement. The Harlem Renaissance is an artistic, literary, cultural movement consciously created out of the Black community to focus on kind of celebrating African American culture, and in hopes of, I guess you could say, normalizing it or uplifting it, is a word that's very commonly used. The thing that you have to be careful of is acknowledging the many good things about the Harlem Renaissance while not overstating it too much. Right? You would never again want to write in an essay something like, you know, and then the 1920s came along and everybody loved Black culture. Yay, kumbaya, right? No. There's, you know, still a strong continuation of segregation. We're going to see, like, when we look at jazz clubs here, for example, this is an interior shot of the Cotton Club. Here's the outside of it. We're going to see plenty of clubs like this that existed in Harlem that played Black music by Black musicians, in a segregated club where the bottom floor was whites only and black patrons either couldn't come in or had to sit in the balcony. So all of the Jim Crow segregation building that's continuing on at the same time as we see this sort of rise in like popularity or celebration of black culture and especially of black music. So the radio, one of the things the radio does is it's going to allow jazz music, which is a regional music that comes out of Southern Black culture, especially out of New Orleans, right, to become a widespread and widely listened to thing. Instead of having to, buy the sheet music and play it yourself in order to hear it, you could just turn on the radio and you could listen to Louis Armstrong, trumpeting this music himself, for example. Jazz is music that focuses or that has a lot of ties to kind of traditional black music, spirituals and things of that nature. It's got a syncopated sound, so that's offbeat, so you have beat, right? And then syncopation happens in the spaces in between the beat, right? And that's very common. That probably sounds pretty normal to you because that's a common feature of like basically all pop music today, but it was a relatively new element. A lot of call and response where like the trumpet will play something and then the piano will play it back with like an interpretation or a spin on it. And it's very brass heavy. Like if you're ever trying to identify, like, am I listening to jazz from the 1920s versus listening to say like something that's more just dance music or something of that nature. You really want to listen for like a heavy trumpet or saxophone, trombone, right? Those kinds of brass instruments are really common in 1920s era jazz. Some musicians whose names you need to know, Louis Armstrong is probably the most famous and the most likely to come up. He's a trumpeter, as you can tell from the picture. This is Bessie Smith, a very well-known vocalist, Duke Ellington, Count Basie, both pianists. We talked a little bit about the Cotton Club already, so it's good to take a look at here. Another big aspect of Harlem Renaissance is the literary scene, Harlem Renaissance literature. All three of these, but especially Langston Hughes and Zora Neale Hurston, are definitely authors who you need to know about and who, Langston Hughes at least, I can almost guarantee you studied a Langston Hughes poem at some point. So Hughes is a poet. His most famous poems are probably, I have Harlem, a Dream Deferred down there. That is this one, right? What happens to a dream deferred? Does it dry up like a raisin in the sun, right? Or does it explode? That poem. And then also his I Too Sing America is great. You guys might have read a common middle school poem that people look at a lot is Mother to Son. It's the one that starts, life to me ain't been no crystal stair, right? It's got tax in it, that one. So that's Langston Hughes, whose poetry is very much about kind of the Black experience. Zora Neale Hurston's most well-known novel is Their Eyes Were Watching God. This is published in 1936, and it's a good example of the fact that the Harlem Renaissance really continues past the 20s and into the 30s pretty strongly. Their Eyes Were Watching God is a really interesting kind of stream of consciousness almost read, focusing on a young Black Southern girl. So those are good names to know for the Harlem Renaissance. Art-wise, when you take a look at Harlem Renaissance, we see a lot of the same aspects of Art Deco that we were looking at just a second ago, but in, again, a very sort of urban and Black culture highlighted type way. So this very urban scene, a scene of a speakeasy, obviously clearly it's still that same kind of shapy look, but more rounded rather than angular in the way that we saw in some of those other Art Deco. This is a very similar, again, idea. Real vibrant colors, lots of like reds and greens and purples, very common in Harlem Renaissance art. Big themes of like celebration of African heritage. You can see the Egyptian theme in this one, and also like the sense of racial uplift. These are two good examples of what's meant by that. You see a lot of times this, the one that's on the right side of your screen here, it's kind of pink washed one, has this idea that the current generation right here in the center is sort of learning about things like science and architecture and reading books because of the past generation down here in the shadows sort of reaching up in chains and looking towards this sort of, bright city on a hill type future that is to come. So this idea that the current generation is like a transitional generation for the Black community is one that we see a lot in the art. A lot of, scenes of the present overlaid with like reminders of, I would say, the past, except there's still quite a bit of lynching going on throughout the South in this time period. You can see kind of the clutching hands back here as well. So this combination of like celebration of modern, but like remembrance of the past and looking towards the future, very, very common in Harlem Renaissance type art. Okay. So when we take a look at the 1920s, we see a little bit of a schizophrenic decade in many ways, a decade that has some things that seem more positive to our modern way of thought, like the Harlem Renaissance and the spread of modernism, etc., mass culture, movies, celebrities, yay, right? But then also has a lot of very reactionary, backlashy type stuff, nativism, the Red Scare, the Klan, right? Laissez-faire in the government, strong isolationism, all of those kinds of things that seem to kind of pull against the spirit of modernism. So when we pick back up with our next set of video notes, we'll be taking a look at what ends the 1920s very decisively, and that is the beginning of the Great Depression. Thanks for your attention, guys.